Now, I don't know who thought it would be a great idea to drop a massive region like this immediately after one of the biggest patch updates in the game's history, but here we are. Now, unlike version 3.0, where it was just like a lot of information that needed to get distilled, 3.1 didn't have nearly as much information, but they scattered it everywhere, so it took a long time to collect. But if you weren't here for the last highlights video, here's how this works. I have gone through all of the Archon quests, story quests, world quests, and event quests, and all of the etc. little notes scattered around the world and all other kind of stuff, and I have distilled all of the important lore bits and compiled them into one handy video just for you. But please keep in mind that this video is only meant to compile the things that we have learned and condense new information, and it is not meant to be a quest recap. I'm making this video assuming that you've either done all of the quests or watched somebody else do them. Now, specifically though, I am expecting you to have witnessed all of the quests that I have listed on screen right now. Pause the video, double check the list if you're sensitive about spoilers, because we're about to enter the spoiler zone. Oh, that was a long disclaimer. Okay, time for the juicy stuff. Starting off with the Sandstorms and the Wall of Samiel. It's a weird place to start, I know, but I want to amend something I said in my 3.1 analysis about how it was weird that there was a wall to keep out sandstorms when the desert sand is actually beneficial to rainforests because it's very rich in nutrients. As it turns out, the sandstorms in Sumeru may also contain fertile sand, but the storms that they're carried in are a manifestation of the withering. So technically, the Wall of Samiel is built to keep out the withering storms and not the sand. In fact, it's possible that the abyssal monsters, like the Rift Wolves, actually caused the sandstorm, since the Rift Wolves were previously linked to the Withering during the Aranyaka quest, and Candace just fights them during the sandstorm, because when sandstorms come, apparently monsters come. That makes sense, right? Now, while the wall was built to stave off these storms of death, it's worth pointing out that the earthquakes that plague the desert are also considered to have the same source as the sandstorms, namely the Murana, or whatever the source of the Murana is, right? The sickness in the Irminsul. Now, dipping a little bit into the theory territory for a second, it's starting to seem like any and all natural and unnatural disasters can be caused by the Murana. It's called the Withering in Sumeru, but I wonder if the holy soil bleaching in Watatsumi Island and the eternal snowstorm in Dragonspine might also fall under the same category. Murana straight up means death, so it's possible that it can take any numbers of forms so long as it's destroying something. Fun fact, the big red swirly thing above the Scarlet King's pyramid is actually a sandstorm of all things. And there's another sandstorm-like tornado in the north of the desert that glows with a suspicious blue light that's awfully reminiscent of the glow of a celestial nail. Now, I repeat this theory a lot, and you can click this video here if you want to see the whole theory, but generally speaking, I think celestial nails are used to repel abyssal leakage. So, having one in the middle of a freaking massive sandnado that's probably caused by the abyss-adjacent Murana monsters might make a lot of sense. Now, on a similar but kind of unrelated topic, let's talk about this whole mad scholar thing. So in the Archon quest, a bunch of mad scholars got kidnapped in order to have their brains sucked out metaphorically by an Akasha headset. The logic of this was kind of weird, so let me see if I can't simplify it. If you recall from the Lazo trailer, Dottore said that divine knowledge cannot be rationally comprehended. Now, by that logic, knowledge that can be rationally comprehended is not divine and therefore cannot be used to create an artificial god of wisdom, which is what Scaramouche is supposed to be, because a god of wisdom obviously needs divine knowledge, I guess. More on that in a second. But scholars like Hypatia have been trying to connect their minds to the Irminsul tree for a long time, but most of those who succeed go mad. The assumption here is that those who went mad because of this must have made contact with divine knowledge that they could not comprehend, so it drove them mad. So, the academia sucks it out of their brains, stuffs it into a divine knowledge capsule, which we'll talk about in a bit again, and feeds it to Scaramouche so that he can become their massive wisdom god mecha machine thing. Yeah, I don't follow it either. But when they're not being kidnapped and having their brains sucked out, the mad scholars are known to the people of Aru Village as village keepers. Basically, the academia allows these mad scholars to keep their Akasha terminals so that they can track their whereabouts, which is sketchy, but that lets Kusanali access their minds directly. Now, while she can't restore their minds, she can stabilize them and lend them her power remotely, which can then be used to prevent damage from earthquakes and stuff to Aru Village, hence the whole village keeper thing, right? They're protecting it. She can't stop the brain sucking, though, and that's how we get divine knowledge capsules. And obviously normal knowledge capsules, except those come from, normal people and Irminsul and not just mad scholars. But anyway, according to Dory, canned knowledge, aka knowledge capsules, comes with some caveats, which we were not aware about before. First off, just like your typical USB drive, knowledge capsules can contain data of any kind, even false data. That's new information. And this makes using them risky because inserting this false data directly into your brain makes it incredibly hard to forget. In addition, excessive use of knowledge capsules diminishes your capacity to think, leading to a type of madness. And you can kind of think of this as a sort of drug that enhances your mental acuity, beneficial at the correct dosage, but dangerous outside of that. Now, since we know the sages are extracting knowledge out of mad scholars, believing them to have divine wisdom locked away in their muddled little brains, it's actually quite likely that there are many divine knowledge capsules in circulation, and at least some of them seem to bear a message from Rukkhadevata, or a warning. But I have to wonder, why is divine knowledge necessary to construct a god? And why would something like a gnosis not be sufficient? When gnosis literally means knowledge and it's like the heart of a god. Does that not make sense to anybody else? Consider the case of Rukkhadevata and Kusanali. It's not entirely clear that divine knowledge is needed, so that means they either have it inherently or they just don't need it because it's not a real thing. When the sages found Kusanali 500 years ago, they expected her to be brimming with wisdom, naturally, from the get-go, just like their beloved Rukkhadevata. Except what they discovered was a very young god whose mind was only at the level of a normal human child. This is a big deal. Because there are a few things we can learn from this. First off, the sages were disappointed in Kusanali and therefore found her lacking because she wasn't up to Rukkhadevata's standard. What kind of young baby god would be at that, whatever. They believed her to be incapable of fulfilling the role of their god of wisdom and therefore decided to construct a brand new god that could fulfill the role rather than to attempt the impossible and resurrect Rukkhadevata, or, I guess, have Kusanali become smarter through other means. Does it not strike anyone else kind of weird that, knowledge capsules, especially divine ones, could, just be given to Kusanali to make her smarter if she's already lacking? Isn't that odd? It just seems like, a young god would be better to use as a basis than, a puppet. But anyway, the second thing we can glean from this is that Kusanali's current knowledge is a result of her own hard work and studies over the course of her 500-year-long life. Meaning, she required a manual process to gain wisdom, and something like a gnosis, which literally means wisdom, like I mentioned before, cannot actually make her wise, otherwise it would have been used regardless of whether or not it was being used currently to power the Akasha, because, priorities. Do you want a new god of wisdom, or do you want to shut down the Akasha for a little bit? Seems like a pretty even trade-off, you know what I mean? But the third thing we can infer from this little tidbit is that Rukkhadevata and Kusanali share some similarities to the Aranara. That was a leap. I know, I'm sorry. If you don't remember, the Aranara have powers that are directly tied to their memories. An Aranara that accrues a lot of memories can become an Ashvata tree, but using large amounts of power burns through those memories, causing them to forget things. So it's like, magic fuel, sort of. As it turns out, Rukkhadevata shares this trait. Now, towards the end of the Archon quest, we're shown an incident from several thousand years ago when the Scarlet King acquired forbidden knowledge, and it brought disaster to the land. Rukkhadevata couldn't save him, but she was able to protect a lot of their people at the cost of an enormous amount of her power, which caused her body to shrink. Now, here's the thing. This is not the first time we've seen this happen to a god. During the Moonchase Festival, we learned that this also happened to Guoba. As Marcosius, he used up all his power and regressed, losing much of his intelligence and shrinking in size. That sets a precedence for this to not just be a Ruka thing, but a god in general thing, which is something else we'll talk about probably in its own video. But it is worth pointing out that this event with the Scarlet King would have had to take place about 2,000 years ago, if not more, which would be about the end of the Archon War or even during the Archon War, meaning Rukkhadevata would not have been an Archon yet. This means this Rukkhadevata, who looks to be about 25-ish physically, reverted back into this body that looks to be about 14-ish physically. And that was before she became the Archon. Which might be why the statue of 7 is too big to be Kusanali. It's not her. It's not the right proportions, right? It's a shrunken Rukkhadevata, which means it's very likely that the statues of 7 are only made for the original Archon and not the current one. So, anyway, that was a side note, sorry. Rukkhadevata shrunk once at least 2,000 years ago, and then she shrunk again when she went to Irminsul. So, the question becomes, why isn't Kusanali considered Rukkhadevata? What is it that Kusanali lacks, if anything? Because it might not be something, because divine knowledge, again, might not be necessary. It might not be the difference between Kusanali and Rukkhadevata. See, the first time Rukkhadevata shrunk, she still retained enough of her memory and power to also retain her identity, just like Guoba. But the second time she shrunk, she basically became a blank slate. No memory means she has to make a completely new identity from scratch. So she effectively becomes an entirely different person. It's not a reincarnation, it's not like a clone, it's just a complete regression. So you could argue that it's not that Kusanali doesn't have divine knowledge, it's that she doesn't have the same level or amount of accrued knowledge that Rukkhadevata had. And that also might mean that in, distilling all of this questionable information that they don't understand from these mad scholars that touched an infected tree, that these sages might actually be further corrupting Scaramouche even more than he already is, which will probably make him less stable, which is probably not a great thing, so that's something to look forward to. But regardless, when it comes to Rukkhadevata and Kusanali, you're kind of left with a ship of Theseus situation. Basically, this thought experiment posed that if you took a ship and you started to replace parts of the ship with new parts, at what point is that ship no longer the same ship? How much of a ship can you replace before it's not the same ship? Can you just replace a board or two? A whole hull? A mast? Can you replace the whole thing? And if you did replace the whole thing, what if you took all of the discarded pieces and reconstructed it into a second ship? Which ship is technically the real ship, the original one? Neither? Both? You apply that logic to a person with their memories, their personality, their genetics, their soul, if you believe in that kind of thing, and well, the question becomes more like, when do you stop being you? Or do you ever stop being you? It's a big philosophical question. Like, Guoba, as tiny as he is, does still retain some memories of his time as Marcosius, as evidenced by him recognizing not only Shao, but also Morax, and Morax recognized him, among other things. But that just means that Guoba never stopped being Marcosius, he just got a new nickname. Kusanali, on the other hand, doesn't remember anything, so her new name is also representing her brand new identity. So that's fun, but you know what's not fun? Eleazar. Before I sat down to make this video, I was convinced that Eleazar and the Hilichurl curse were the same thing. Do I still think that? Well, yes and no. So in the abandoned hospital and the ruin golem in the Valley of Dari, you can find notes describing diseases that sound fairly similar to each other, but with some notable differences. We know the cases in the hospital are Eleazar, but the ones in the Dari golem are a little bit more unclear. Although a lot of the symptoms and the descriptions in the notes seem to be describing a Hilichurl, so I'm in favor of assuming that this is describing the process of turning into a Hilichurl, especially based on where you find these notes. Now, if you compare the symptoms of Eleazar to the symptoms that are described in these notes that I think belong to Hilichurl cursing, you'll find that some of them overlap. To illustrate my point, symptoms for Eleazar include ulceration on the body, scabs that turn into dark gray scales, loss of mobility and eventual paralysis, fatigue, loss of appetite, fever, vomiting, and abnormal levels of elemental energy in the body. Now, symptoms for the Hilichurl curse include facial ulceration, peeling skin, language impairment, mental deterioration, proliferation of hair growth, necrosis in the limbs, and hallucinations. So you can see that there's some overlap here, but it's not quite enough of an overlap to call them the same ailment. However, this idea of increased elemental energy in the body from Eleazar lines up with the theory I had about elemental energy being similar to radiation in terms of how it behaves. I'll leave a link in the description to that video if you're interested. But Eleazar lines up really well with the symptoms of radiation poisoning, which include blisters and ulcers on the skin, vomiting, fever, hair loss, loss of appetite, disorientation, atrophy of the body, skin peeling, and fibrosis, mostly keloids. As you can see, the three ailments have quite a bit more overlap, which suggests they're at least related. Or they at least have the same root cause, which is excessive elemental energy in the body. Now, they may have the same root cause, but the differences in symptoms are most likely due to variations in the type of exposure, the duration of the exposure, and the amount of energy the patient was exposed to. In my opinion, a hilly curse seems to be a more severe variation than Eleazar, since it can't be treated. Now, I want to reiterate that Eleazar is known to be a manifestation of the Withering, and it was also the result of King Deshret's pursuit of forbidden knowledge that infected the land, because it only appeared after he did that. Now, most assume that this Withering means it sucks the life out of a place, but it is equally possible that the Withering is the exact opposite and is simply overloading areas with elemental energy. It's a little similar to how you can dump an entire container of fertilizer onto a plant. The fertilizer might actually be good for the plant, but in that high of a dose, it'll actually overload the plant, it'll burn the roots, and the plant will then wither. Seeing as Eleazar and high levels of elemental energy in the body have a causal link, we might be more inclined to view the withering zones as areas where ley lines are bleeding and therefore leaking out too much energy, which is, causing the plants to overload. It's like poisoning, almost. Anyway, this topic deserves an entire video on its own, but this will just have to do for now. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the Golden Slumber Quest and King Deshret, aka the Scarlet King, which is the name I'm going to be using for consistency's sake. Now, if you read any of the books that were released in 3.0, none of the information in the Golden Slumber Quest will be new. None of it. Basically none of it. The desert mostly cleared up a lot of confusion, confirmed some theories, and added some nuance to some of the actions, but on the whole, not a whole lot that's new here. Well, there's a lot to infer from a deep lore side of things, but that's not the purpose of this video, so we're not doing that today. The quest itself is basically just a running commentary on how academics can grossly misinterpret the history of a location or people while they dismiss the inherited knowledge of the local population. For example, Tirzad suggests that the sun and the eye here symbolize the Scarlet King and that he's being propped up by 7 pillars. However, elsewhere we learn that the Scarlet King actually had 7 apostles, so this mural is depicting people and not pillars. I think this will be an ongoing theme in-game, which is the only reason why I'm bringing it up. As for the nuancy bits of critical information that got confirmed, those mostly had to do with the relationship between Rukkhadevata, the goddess of flowers, and the fate of the Scarlet King. And basically, the Scarlet King and Rukkhadevata were friends well over 2,000 years ago. I'm going to estimate at least 2,500 years ago, but it could be a lot longer ago. And anyway, these 3 co-ruled the entire region of Sumeru along with another god, the goddess of flowers. Nilu's outfit is based off of her. Now, at some point, the goddess of flowers willingly went to her death, we don't know why, and the Scarlet King went mad with grief and had decided to pursue the dream of an eternal utopia, free of suffering. This sounds familiar. This endeavor led him to discover forbidden knowledge, which looks an awful like abyssal black chasm mud, which he then used to separate his mind from his body, only to then merge his mind with the millions of other minds of his people, creating what we know of as the Golden Slumber. Don't ask me how it works, I don't know. He could have been sucked into the abyss or a subspace or who knows what. It's the one thing I wanted to learn more about and then we just don't. So, yeah. Anyway, again, the forbidden knowledge he sought, which looks a hell of a lot like the chasm's dark mud, leaked out into the world, causing untold disaster, which also sounds familiar because it sounds just like the Cataclysm. Now, Rukkhadevata used up a great deal of her power trying to contain it in order to save the people, which caused her to revert to a much younger form of herself. I promise I will go into much greater depth on the Scarlet King and the actual story and everything else in another video, but there's a lot to the story, not necessarily new that was revealed here. it is just not worth going over in, like a highlights video. So we're not going to do that today. Anyway, one thing I do want to say, though, is that I think we can safely assume that in Genshin, ancient astronaut theory is alive and well. Again, more on that in another video. Alrighty, my little dudes, it's time for the rapid fire round. This is a round where we just go off and rattle off a lot of tiny little lore bits that have no real long explanational sections. We're going to start off with the Akasha system. As it turns out, this system can take previously acquired datasets and use them to predict new datasets, just like a supercomputer. That's fun. I'm kind of fascinated by this because they used it to predict Cyno's movements during the Archon quest. But that's not why it's interesting. See, the Akasha and the Irminsul parallel each other in a lot of ways. Like, they have a lot of little similarities. So I'm sitting here wondering, if the Akasha can predict the future based on past data, is it possible that the Irminsul is doing the same thing, just with a much larger data set and a much greater processing capacity, right? Like, what if the Irminsul isn't actually responsible for a true and absolute fate, like our constellations might suggest, but is instead predicting fate based on past memories and actions? I think that's very fun food for thought. I want to revisit this idea at some point. We'll see how that goes. Oh, I bet most of you, though, were surprised at the lack of Scaramouche in this video. There are two reasons for that. First, none of the information presented here was technically new. In fact, I've covered most of it in previous videos, so if you want details on his backstory or anything else, I will leave some links in the descriptions that you can check out. But secondly, y'all are going to be sick of hearing me talk about him once 3.2 comes, so I'm just going to spare you guys that pain for right now, all right? However, there is one thing I'd like to touch on in regards to his Daydream cutscene, which is a bit of an ironic name when you remember that his mom's teaser was named Nightmare, but anyway, that thing is the place Scaramouche was discarded in this cutscene. The cutscene suggests that he was discarded in the slumbering court on Sayrai Island, but I'm like 70% sure that this is an animation error. The rest of his lore places him at the Shake Pavilion, which he identifies as his home in his artifact set, as well as, Kanazuka. It would be really odd, although not impossible, for him to be left at Sayrai Island and then, hitch a ride with pirates or something, fleeing the Thunderbird, I guess. But there's just no evidence of him being there apart from this one scene. And there's also no evidence that artifact domains share any lore relevance, location-wise, with the stories in the sets that they have. This would be a first, so I'm skeptical. Again, not impossible, but also not likely. We'll talk more about this in 3.2 when we do a complete Scaramouche analysis. I just want to touch on it. It is an understatement to say a lot of people have pointed out how similar Cyno is to Razor, from their hair and eye colors to their headgear to their vision placements and the belts hanging off their waist, and even similar tattoos and play styles due to them both being possessed by a wolf or dog spirit. Razor's even wearing a Sumeru fabric for his shirt, alright? That said, I don't think they're actually related. But I do think it's possible that the spirits that possess them are related. See, Cyno is obviously possessed by a spirit akin to the jackal god of death, Anubis, but did you know that Anubis had another doggy relative? His name was Wepwawet. I hope I said that right, and he was often associated and confused with Anubis by academics since they have similar roles in Egyptian mythology. I just thought that was a neat tidbit in light of learning about how Razor's parents were adventurers. It's possible that Razor was actually born in Sumeru because of that, and that's how he got that spirit. Okay, we already knew that the wind was related to time because the god of time Istaroth is also known as the Thousand Winds, but Venti being Venti loves to make himself even more suspicious every time he shows up. During the Weinlesefest, Venti summoned the winds of the far-flung past, which more or less meant that he carried messages or words from the past into the present. That's a special skill we did not know he had. I loved the little Lorebits here, and it's nice to see Diluc's dad was actually really proud of him and that Kaya's father didn't really want to leave him behind. That it's always been kind of weird to, look at like the bartending event and say, Diluc's dad was really hard on him. He must not have been like a really caring father. And then, Kaya's father left him behind. So, he must have actually abandoned him and not felt too bad about it. Or, he wanted him to be a child spy or soldier or whatever. And it's just nice to see that that's not the case. Okay. I like that. But it's also worth noting that Kaya's father didn't sound anything like Piero, so I don't think the whole Piero is Kaya's dad theory is gonna hold much water anymore. So, Piero for Kaya's grandfather theory, let's go, brr! Oh, and before I forget, about Venti. You know how we usually get an Albedo event in December along with his rerun? Well, that's not happening this year. Albedo is getting a rerun now in October, which means that we will most likely not be getting an event with him this winter. Now, I know Venti also just had a rerun, but he was kinda sketchy in the event, saying that he's the North Wind, and the North Wind usually hibernates in the winter, so I'm wondering if something will happen to Venti in December this year, where he kinda just poofs. Maybe we'll get some Venti lore, but not from Venti. I'm suspicious. So I had a couple of fun thoughts about Dottore I wanted to share. The clone in the Archon quest was labeled Omega Build, which is kinda sketchy for 2 reasons. First, the Greek lettering has only appeared in Enkanomiya prior to this, so apparently Dottore knows a language used by a unified civilization. That's kinda sketchy. And second, there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, meaning Dottore may have up to 24 clones since Omega is literally the last letter in that alphabet, so 24 Dottores is yikes, okay? In the same breath as Enkanomiya, it's very likely that the Scarlet King civilization was also part of the unified civilization spoken about in Enkanomiya. The two share a lot in common when it comes to architecture, and they do slot nicely together in terms of timeline and geography. Greece, which is what Enkanomiya was based on, was quite involved historically with Egypt, after all. There is a lot to be said for the shared gameplay mechanics around the time dilations and invisible time travel-y wall thingies too. It just seems like the desert had a lot more technology that was able to be preserved than Enkanomiya did. That could potentially mean that the ruins in the desert are older than 4,000 years. There is another very popular theory about El-Haytham being a reincarnation of the Scarlet King, or something similar because his eyes match the eye of the Scarlet King so well. Now, I'm hesitant to buy into the reincarnation theory, but I do think it's possible he inherited something from the Scarlet King, or, like Candace, is a descendant. I wanted to point it out because Dia also has similar coloring, as does Candace. El-Haytham has the Scarlet King's pupil, Dia has the iris, and Candace has the purple outer rim. Will it mean anything? Who knows? Still worth thinking about. But outside of the eye part of the Scarlet King, we have this black star, typically with 8 primary points. Now, the thing is, this symbol has mostly been associated with Conria prior to this, and more recently, the Abyss Order. The Dark Serpent Knights and the Abysslings have the black star on their chests and war banners, and Halfdan also has it on his military uniform. Now you pair this idea with the multiple references to the people of Dari, who are Conrians, and you realize it's quite possible that Sumeru is more closely connected to Conria than we thought, or that any other nation is, which is weird because we thought that was Mondstadt before. Especially since Dainsleif states that in the Chasm, the architecture we associate with Enkanomiya resembles the architecture in Conria, and since we already established that the Enkanomiya architecture and the desert architecture are quite similar with some minor regional differences, Conria could be an offshoot of this civilization and therefore have a similar architectural style. You can also kind of see it in their robots, which, while they use different languages to do so, both contain the same kinds of writing along their rims. Anyway, fun food for thought. My brain is going to be so full, so stuffed full. Nom 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 nom. Anyway, alrighty guys, that's all from me for now. I'll be back with some proper theories very, very, very soon, so stay tuned, pace yourself, and try not to get lost in the infinite underground hunting for bugs. There are so many tunnels! Why are there so many tunnels? I'm dying.